I decided to take a break from the cabinet carcass and make the top. I ripped some slats from the 4/4 oak and then planed them down to 7/8 inch thick. After joining the edges further, I laid out the slats and match marked them for biscuits. I first made two separate halves of the top so I could run both through my planer. That way, I only had one seam to manually clean up. I find it best to clean the edges of the biscuit slots of any tear out with a sharp chisel. I don't know if biscuits are necessary for the strength of the joint, but they sure help out with alignment during gluing. Once the two top pieces dried, I planed them down to 3/4 thick, butted them together, marked and cut slots, and glued and clamped them. I then sanded that center seam. Next, I ripped and trimmed the top to final dimensions, about 1/8 inch bigger than the cabinet perimeter on the front and sides. Next, I checked the fit of the top on the cabinet, then made some banding for the front and sides to cover the end grain. I had some quarter sawn white oak that I ripped to 1 inch wide and planed down to 7/8 inch thick. I put a 1/2 inch roundover bit in my router table and, making progressive passes, cut a nose on the top and bottom of one edge of the white oak. Next, I used my sliding miter jig on my table saw to cut one miter each in two pieces for the ends of the top. I used a mitered scrap to locate the side trim pieces, then clamp them in place. With the side pieces clamped in place, I could sneak up on the miter cut for the front piece that fits between them. Finally, I cut biscuit slots and glued the three nose pieces in place. Once the glue was dry, I gave the completed top a good sanding, then set it aside since it would just be in the way during drawer and door mounting. With the top done, I started on the two doors for the front. I ripped some short pieces for panels, glued them in sections, then planed them to 3/4 inch thick. I then glued the sections together, trimmed the edges, and ran the panels through my raised panel bit, just like the side panels. For the rails and stiles of the doors, I used a cope and stick router bit set to add some detail to the cabinet front. I ripped and planed some short blanks, including extras, for door rails and stiles. The extras came in handy for adjusting the separate router bits. With the bit height set, I first made progressive passes on the stiles to make the stick half of the joint. I then switched bits, and again with multiple passes and using a sacrificial backstop block, progressively cut the rail ends, also known as the cope half of the joint. Now that all the pieces of the door frames were milled up, I could assemble them. I added space balls again between the raised panel and the frame members, then glued and clamped the door assemblies together. Next, I started on the two drawers. I ripped some 1/2 inch thick poplar to 2 1/2 inch width, then trimmed it to length to make the drawer sides. I then ran those pieces through the router table to cut a 1/4 inch wide notch for the drawer bottom. Finally, I routed out the ends on two of the pieces to make lap joints. I also cut two pieces of 1/4 inch plywood for the bottoms. Then I glued and clamped the drawer parts together, making sure the corners were square. Once the drawers had dried, I flipped them over and installed the bottom mount drawer slides.